Yeah, there's a waiting room, so people are coming in now.
Okay. Oh, they're coming in. Oh, we are live. That's what it says. Okay.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your patience. We're having a couple technical difficulties, so really excited to see everyone coming in. Thank you again for your patience while we got up and running. We're still waiting. Will Alexander is just having a couple technical problems. He should be joining us very shortly. So I think I'll just kick things off because I know everyone's been waiting a little bit. Dorothy and Janice will probably take it from there if Will is not in yet. Hopefully he'll be in by the time I get through the introduction. Dorothy was just saying to me that, you know, make it a long introduction just so we can give a little time for that. There's technical difficulties to be resolved. But anyways, thank you again for coming. Good evening. Welcome to Business as Usual, Protracted Tribulations, a discussion between the writers Will Alexander, Janice Lee, and Dorothy Wang. My name is Quentin Ring, and I am the director of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center in Venice, California. We are a literary space dedicated to cultivating new writing, presenting contemporary literature and art, and thinking about poetry and language. Tonight, we're joined by three writers who are themselves deeply invested in thinking about poetics and about both the possibilities and limits of language. I'm so glad to welcome all of them, and particularly thankful to Will Alexander for proposing and organizing this program. Will is our longtime poet in residence and one of our major creative collaborators and inspirations. He mentioned to me that he wanted to invite Janice and Dorothy to have a wide-ranging sort of freewheeling discussion that responded in part to the tumultuous recent events. They include the ongoing pandemic and historic uprisings against police violence and white supremacy. I was delighted to help put the program together, and I'm really thrilled to have all of our participants here with us for this discussion. I should also say thank you to the Department of Cultural Affairs, Los Angeles, for sponsoring this program. Before we get started, I did want to mention also that Beyond Baroque hasn't been hosting too many live events like this, but we have been hosting and continue to host a number of online workshops. Upcoming workshops include one on the art of the chat book with Lynn Thompson, a generative workshop with Elena Karina-Byrne, and a workshop on the intersection of poetry and technology with Margaret Rhee. I think all those will be fabulous. Excuse me, they're starting mid-July, so please do consider checking those out if you're interested in taking a workshop. We'll put links for those in the chat if anyone is interested in signing up, or you can go to beyondbaroque.org for more information. We expect the program this evening to last about an hour. Towards the end of the panel, we'll be taking questions via the Q&A. As I mentioned, this is one of our first live events, so again, apologies for the technical difficulties. If we still continue to have the technical difficulties, we might move up the Q&A a little bit. Janice and Dorothy can talk a little bit if Will can't make it in, and we can maybe start the Q&A a little earlier, but they'll give you the signal for that. I think the only other thing I just want to do is introduce our participants and then leave them to discussion. Will Alexander, who we hope makes it in just a second, is a poet, novelist, playwright, essayist, visual artist, and pianist. He has written 40 books, and his honors include an American Book Award, the Penn Oakland Award, the Jackson Prize for Poetry, and a special Lifetime Achievement Award from Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. He's currently Beyond Baroque's Poet-in-Residence and lives here in Los Angeles. Janice Lee is a Korean-American writer, editor, publisher, and shamanic healer. She's the author of 7 books of fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry, including Karatakis, Daughter, Damnation, Reconsolidation, The Sky Isn't Blue, Imagine a Death, and Separation Anxiety. Those last 2 are forthcoming. She is founder and executive editor of Entropy, co-publisher at Civil Coping Mechanisms, contributing editor at Fanzine, and co-founder of the Accomplices LLC. She currently lives in Portland, Oregon, where she is an assistant professor of creative writing at Portland University. Dorothy Wang is professor of American Studies at Williams College and is the author of Thinking Its Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry. which won the Association for Asian American Studies 2016 award for Best Book of Literary Criticism, and was named to the New Yorker's The Books We Loved in 2016 year-in list. The first national conference on race and creativity writing was named after the book and was held in 2014, 2015, and 2017. We're actually just talking about whether the conference would continue. I hope it does. She also conceived of and co-founded the Race and Poetry and Poetics Collective in the UK. Thank everyone so much for tuning in. Thank you, Janice and Dorothy, for being here. Hopefully we'll get Will in just a second. I'm gonna go ahead and leave you to the discussion. We'll sort of make it up as we go along as we're waiting. And again, thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Thanks, Quentin.
So one thing that I'll say is, as we're waiting, both Dorothy and I wanted to just invite questions in the chat. So, we wanted this to be sort of interactive. So if there are comments or questions, please feel free to include those in the chat and we'll try to look out for those. But Dorothy, maybe we can just start out, we can continue, like we started talking a little bit earlier on the phone, just in terms of what this moment sort of means for us and how we see this working in a broader sense. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about your interest in the sort of broader history that we're looking at.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, we're hoping Will come on at any second. He's the one who's been kind of the energizing force behind this. But yeah, I mean, I think you and I were also speaking about this, Janice, about the meaning of the protests right now, but the connection to poetry and in my for what I do, poetry studies. You guys are practicing poets, so I'd be curious to hear what you're thinking about that. But I think both you and I were saying that obviously there's a lot of visibility now with the protests, and there's been a lot of different things happening. But I think both of us agree that there's a sort of longer history behind a lot of both the problems and the possible solutions, that things are going to be, there's going to be a lot of work, I think, to undo centuries of things that are underlying the way we think about poetry or about race, frankly. So I don't know if for you, I could say more, but I'm wondering if you might want to just talk about from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking a lot with friends in terms of like what's going on in this moment, right? And I think in a lot of ways, this particular moment, we've had other moments like this before in history, but I think one thing that
you're on.
That's Will.
Is that Will coming in?
Hello.
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 Will. Here, you can talk.
I guess Will's coming on.
Okay. You can talk on it.
Will, can you hear us? Will?
No, I sound this off.
Okay. Well, Janice, you can continue what you were saying, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, one thing I think is like this moment is teaching us to sit with uncertainty and discomfort, and that's what's sort of happening in this event right now, right? A lot of uncertainty. But yeah, I've been thinking, I think what's unique about this moment is that it's not just a political movement where we're trying to find action through protests and through direct action, is that actually because this pandemic is also happening at this global level, that there's an opportunity, I think, for a lot more dismantling, right? And I mean that in a really with a lot of difficulty. I think what this moment asks of us is that there's a potential opportunity if we can be brave enough to actually really face like the potential loss and difficulty that will come with the dismantling of all of these narratives. And I think it's not just race and white supremacy, but it's also a moment where everyone's being asked to face their traumas and their wounds, right? Which is where a lot of this comes from. And so all of these different narratives around why, poetry even exists in the way that it exists, why we relate to others in the way that we relate, all of that, I think, together.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As we witness.
I'm hoping Will, I guess Will's trying to connect. Right. So I think one of the things is that because of the dovetailing of the pandemic and obviously the murders of George Floyd and others, and I think that there's a whole question of, for me, like where this dovetails with poetry and poetics and poetry studies is a long history of colonial practices and institutional structures that have been put in place that are part and parcel of what's happening today, but also are legacies of things that have happened from a long time ago. So, and so when I think about, say, poetry studies, and I've written about this a little bit, which is that people tend to think of poetry as being very separate from police brutality, or poetry studies and poetry being very separate from violence, murder, genocide. And actually, it's, it's part and parcel of a whole larger system at work that has been going on for quite a while. So I think and so I think in the work of at least scholarship, and again, you guys are practicing poets, but in the work of scholarship around poetry studies, we have to think further back than just the immediate situation of whether, like, representation is very important. The representation of people of color, of poets of color, and there are all these debates all the time and controversies around that. And I think those aren't inconsequential, but I think a lot of things go back much further to thinking very fundamentally, even about our basic ideas about poetry and poetics. And just the ways in which poetry has been used to actually further white supremacy and colonial practices, to not be too direct about it. But so I think that's a big interest of mine, and thinking historically. I know Will is also, I know Will can't get on, it seems like, but he's been very interested. I know in our conversations, he and I talk a lot about how far back he's thinking around a lot of these issues. And,
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I was in LA, Will and I would meet sort of like monthly in Chinatown to have these conversations like around these very topics. And in some ways, for a few years, even before this, we kind of both felt like energetically like something was coming. And this is sort of the culmination of that energetic resonance, I think. But I agree with you. I think language is really critical in terms of how we think about these things, because it's how things have been aestheticized or represented. That's what poetry and literature really is. I think as someone who works a lot with sentences, I think about this a lot, like on the sentence level, in terms of like the legacy of colonialism that's inherent just in the structure of the sentence in the English language, which is something, when I talk about this with my students, they like have no idea what I'm talking about. Right, especially if you don't speak any other language, it's like, oh, this is just how language works, and this is just how things are ordered. This is just how it is, right?
Right.
But if we like dig deeper into that, there's all of these structures that only allow for certain types of stories, and the kind of like simplification and cohesion that becomes really dangerous, because what are the narratives that don't fit in syntactically or grammatically or linguistically into these structures and containers that actually have been created by us very arbitrarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right, at the level of the sentence, as you said, and also I think earlier you and I were talking about the kinds of expectations or categories of writing in which certain kinds of, we were talking specifically about Asian American writing, or certain kinds of writing that don't fit into the expectations people have of, say, Asian American writing or Asian American female writing, or different, so I think that that's really important. And I think also when I think about literary criticism, we have to think about the fact that, there's like the practice of close reading, and I've written about this a little bit, the practice of close reading, even though I think it's a wonderful method and I use it in my classes all the time, but it actually is tied to some pretty unsavory practices like eugenics, and not directly, but indirectly, but still quite crucially. So I think that those are things that it's hard for people to wrap their heads around. And I think sometimes the response is either like, oh, I didn't know that, or it's like, oh yeah, we already knew that. So I get a kind of odd response when I talk about like the link of race science to poetry and poetics and close reading. So, and some people are like, yeah, I thought I heard that from before. And I'm like, no, actually, I don't think people have talked about it. Maybe they have, and I just didn't know about it. But so I think that response about thinking much more historically, but also having to think really hard about the imbrication of poetry and poetics with some less savory practices, but also, as you were saying, Janice, at the very level of the sentence as well,
Yeah, and for me, like as someone who what I've been teaching in my workshops and in the classroom a lot is actually a lot around trauma and inherited trauma and healing. And I think what you know, a lot of my students and people I talk to are realizing is like, the work that has to be done right now, the anti-racist work that people are trying to do, it's not actually just about educating yourself, right? It's not just learning the facts and just reading books and learning the history. It's actually also like the work of healing from PTSD, like essentially,
Oh, yeah.
right? And that is linked to, you know, all of the different stories that we have, that we're tied to, like the ways in which we hold on to our identities. Those are all narratives, and that has to do with the language that we've been brought up into, all of the systems that we've been brought up into, and that's all related to how we relate to each other and race, right? But it's all connected, and I think that's what's so difficult about this moment is, you know, I hear lots of people talking about how exhausting it is to do this work, and for a lot of people, it's just been exhausting to like be alive, right, and just to survive. But it's like, you know, facing and healing from trauma isn't easy work, but that's actually the only way. And otherwise, everything else that we do, even if we're out in the streets doing this work, if we're not actually working on that, on the difficult stuff on the inside, it's all bypass, right? It's not gonna instigate actual transformation.
Yeah, it's really tough because I think on the one hand, like I agree with you totally. I feel like every person of color in the academy is suffering from PTSD, like whether they acknowledge it or not, or maybe every poet too, but probably every person of color in this society, in this world. But certainly in the academy, I feel like for people of color, especially if you have any kind of political consciousness and you're not just going to go along with the program, there is this constant PTSD. So, but there is that work in which you have to work on yourself and, you know, like take care of yourself, but then you're also being asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting around race and diversity at the institution you're in. So I think one of the difficult things is actually being able to, I mean, obviously we know right now, like every institution is putting out a PR statement about being like against racism, right? Like everybody, like from Amazon to, you know, every like college around the country and around the world. So, and the question is like that whole, like, what is that rhetoric and how to, I mean, that rhetoric is part of the trauma, frankly. I mean, that's inflicting trauma. I'm sorry, you know, like, because that rhetoric is being put out there at the same time that like people of color and poets of color are being just crushed or pummeled by these. I mean, not everyone's in an institution, so I'm speaking much more as a person, an academic within an institution. But I know you teach at a place, I mean, a university, but not all writers do. But I just think that there's a lot of questions about like signifying rhetoric, people doing things out, you know, like whether it is like an institution putting out a PR statement or even like writers of color, like sort of talking about certain things, but what is like the actual dismantling is going to be really grassroots level and tough. And I think a lot of it is going to put more strain on people, and that question of like taking care of yourself and healing from trauma while also having to do a lot of work to dismantle like colonial practices that have gone on for a really long time that aren't very glamorous dismantling. I mean, like this stuff that's out of the eye of social media, a lot of hard work that has to be done. So I think that's a huge question about how one can both heal from trauma and do the dismantling.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the thing that doesn't get addressed as often is like the trauma of being white, right? Like all of the trauma that white people have that doesn't actually get addressed, and there's no space for that. And so then it comes out in these other ways, and so it's the re-traumatizing of Black people and Indigenous people and people of color because that trauma is not actually being dealt with at all, right? I mean, you know, in some ways, I mean, I think about like I think about how the hegemonic structures that we're in, these aren't just like structures that are like one-sided, right? Like colonialism, like this is not something that like is an oppression, a system of oppression that has just existed in a one unidirectional way, right? There's been like a degree of complacency, whether it's been conscious or unconscious. And I think especially like being Asian American, like in this country, right? My parents came here and there's all of these like ideas of linear success that I was ingrained with. And so a lot of that has to do with like, here are the things that you have to do to survive, because here's the alternative of like what your life could look like, and here's what it's supposed to look like. But then the complacency is also like, how do we like participate in the system of capitalism, right? Unknowingly also continuing to inflict harm upon like Black and Indigenous people, for example, right? Like how have we benefited from those systems? And that for me, I think is like something that I think about often, but it's like really hard to come to terms with, because it's like, you know, however many decades of, if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't have survived. And yet,
I think, right.
Another way, right? But we think so much about what it is that we've earned, and I think this is everyone. We like feel like we deserve what it is that we have because we've earned it and we've worked hard for it. And there's danger in that narrative also, because then it means that we deserve to hold on to it. And what does that come at the expense of?
Yeah, I mean, this is tough. I mean, this is actually that question of, just to go back a little bit to what you were saying, Janice, about the trauma of white people. I agree that there is trauma, but I am also, it's also really clear that the system of racial capitalism has, I mean, I think everyone's traumatized by it, right? But there's no question that, for me at least, I feel like the anti-racist work I want to do is definitely prioritizing the treatment of like the mistreatment of people of color. But I absolutely hear you that I think everyone, like Faulkner has written about this. I think a lot of people, Claudia Rankin, people have talked about how there's been psychic damage to white people. But I just feel like they get a lot of space in culture to talk about their, I mean, not maybe in this way, but to talk about their psychic pain a lot of times. And I think actually the history of lyric poetry, or the history of poetry, has given a lot of space to white personal pain. And that's been universalized to a great extent and actually made into a kind of like thing that we should all care about, which, you know, I see it and I'm sympathetic, but I'm also like, it's time to like change the script a little bit maybe. So I think I do hear you on that, but I also, yeah, it's hard. I think the question of Asian Americans, which you touch upon, the success story, I think at this moment there is a lot of tension, and and we can go into this or not. I wish Will were here as part of this conversation, but the tension among like POC and Black and Indigenous people, and also that desire for the support. And I think that for Asian Americans, my own story is so unusual because I grew up in the South, and I grew up in like a really kind of mainly pretty rural Southern, I grew up in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. And my parents were academics and immigrants, but my town was almost 50% Black. So I have a very different experience, which isn't to say that I'm immune from all the racism and all the anti-Blackness and everything. But I think that the success story, the kind of like success story that a lot of Asian Americans got indoctrinated to, I got some of that, but it was kind of different too. So, but I do understand that a lot of Asian Americans, the proximity to whiteness is seductive for everyone, right? And I think the difficult position for Asian Americans is that that they have often chosen the proximity to whiteness, and that's terrible and understandable and terrible at the same time. But I also think that that I guess, you know, I just want there to be hope that there are other possibilities as well, you know. Because basically what all people of color face, whether they're poets or anybody, is we're all sort of pitted against one another in this system, this long-standing system of racial capitalism. So we're all, and of course, Black people have suffered under chattel slavery and under police, like utter bodily violence in a way that you and I will never face. But what we all go through, whether we're Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, or Black, we're all part of this larger structure that has created the situation for all of us, you know, psychically. It's not like it's unchangeable, but it's gone on for quite a long time.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. And I think the difficulty comes from, you know, how do we transform the system without constantly replicating the system, right? Like, it's really hard to see outside of the moment that we're in. I think I'm getting a delivery right now.
Okay. Okay, well, ignore it.
But one of you know, this anecdote that I really like a lot is like, you know, the story about a man that's locked in a room and all he has is a window of the blue sky outside, right? And he's asked to draw an image of what freedom looks like for him. And the image that he draws is the window, is a blue window, right? Because that's all he has, right? But this is like, the issue is that his vision of freedom is exactly the architecture of his imprisonment, right? And I think about that a lot, because I think for a lot of us, especially with the way that capitalism has such this like huge hold literally over every aspect of our lives, right? Like not even when just money is involved, but I'm thinking about like publishing in a literary community, and like why all of the validation that we seek when we are just publishing like a poem or an essay, right? Is all of those are part of the system that still continues to imprison us, right? And we're constantly seeking freedom in that same system. And that's an impossible kind of task that we've kind of given ourselves, is that how do we seek freedom in the same architecture that we're trying to escape? And so I think sometimes like this idea of escape itself is problematic, because we're just constantly coming back to where it is that we started. And that's sort of the impossibility. And it's like the question that I want to think about is like, how do we escape that entanglement of the container and the content, right? When we're just in that loop.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it's I'm wondering, because I'm seeing things on my screen that they're chat. Like, are there chat things, or should we check, Janice? Because I'm seeing that.
I mean, if people have any questions and you want to,
or Q&A.
Yeah, I don't see any.
Okay, there is actually a question in the Q&A section. Should I just read it out loud? Janice, do you see it? Okay, John K. This is a huge and perhaps too simplistic question, but what might a non-neoliberal, anti-Black, racist / anti-racist, and decolonized and decolonizing poetics, poetic practice, and poetry studies look like? I'm not suggesting there's one way, but what might some options be? What do we, what we so about,
I think it's what do we do?
What do we do about the institutions and the structures, histories, and traumas they replicate and reinforce, as Dorothy suggests? Okay, good question.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, so what do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we can.
What might a non-neoliberal, anti-Black, racist / anti-racist, and decolonizing poetics, poetic practice, and poetry studies look like? Okay.
I mean, I don't know if I know what that looks like, right? Like I feel like if I knew what that looked like, I would be working towards it. I mean, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, the Black Buddhist, talks about this, you know, in terms of like that liberation that we're constantly seeking. It's something that we have never seen on this planet. None of us have actually ever seen what this looks like, and yet we know it exists, and it is what we're working towards, right? But I don't know what that looks like.
I have some ideas about poetry studies, which is what I do. I mean, I don't know about poets, but I know for poetry studies what I could imagine it looking like. One would be not only sprinkling in more poets of color, but actually making central the work of like experiment. Okay, so I'll just say, I think a lot of the most exciting work done today is by experimental minority poets, including you and Will. There are a lot of other people, but I think the most like kind of energetic work happening. So I would love to see a discussion of just poetics, like basic ideas of poetics, centering that kind of work rather than always centering like the high modernists like Pound and Eliot, even though I think they're great poets, like centering them when we talk about poetics, and then only including people of color when it's about like, oh, I'm going to do a course on like Black poetry, or I'm going to do a course on like social poetics or something, right? So I think that there's ways in which we have to practice like the scholarship differently. And I've actually seen, Janice, so we do have a lot of questions on the chat side, on the chat. I don't know if you get on this.
I wonder if is Will in here?
I see Will's box, but I'm also seeing, should I just read some of these other questions?
Sure.
Somebody said Will is.
Well, can you hear me?
Can you hear us, Will?
Yeah.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. At least something is happening.
Yeah, we've been
some snafus on this end, and I apologize, but I want to get into the stream as we go.
Okay.
And
have you heard us, Will, at all? Have you heard what we've been talking about or not?
Yeah, I'm hearing about what you're saying about the dearth of poets of color in the canon.
Yeah, but I was saying not only that we don't only add in people, but that we actually rethink the very central like ideas of poetics, so that we're not always focusing on like canonical white poets to think about central ideas and then adding on some Black, brown, or yellow, but you know, to really like
we should
center like, you know, a lot of poets of different types of poets, right?
Also, I think we not only should change the horizontal movement, but the vertical movement in terms of getting a new kind of mind that approaches language.
Right. That's a good idea. Yeah.
A mind that is looking for things outside of quotidian logistics, or outside of making sense, or that small circular enclave of the person that has nothing to do with any kind of meta conditions, you know, like you said, the racial situation or the class situation that approaches all the old structures.
Mm-hmm.
When you were mentioning eugenics earlier, about that closed circle, the psychology of eugenics.
Right.
Keeps one baited and tucked away. It's like the way that, say, British poets of color are not able to really access the printed page is such. There are some, but it's not in the single digits in terms of percentages. I'd say around 7-8%. And the new energy of English is never properly explored. It's like a 19th century idea about how English should be conducted.
Right. I mean, I think, yeah, that idea of eugenics going, well, you know, a lot of us know about that whole, the views of like Thomas Jefferson about Phyllis Wheatley. A lot of us know about this, like these sort of race science ideas about the incapacity of what he said, Black people did not have the capacity to be poets. And I think that idea kind of does undergird a lot of people's thinking about minority poets, that there's somehow a lack or a gap, right? But I think, Will, you're specifically talking about, I think some of the stuff you and I were talking about earlier about the link between literary criticism in England when it started as having a link to eugenics, actually, which is, and there's a scholar, John Guillory, who's written about the link between this neurophysiologist, Sir Charles Sherrington, and the practice of new criticism, or what they call practical criticism in England, because I.A. Richards had read a lot of Sherrington and was trying to understand, to democratize the practice of reading, so that to try to understand who had the capacity, cognitive or biological capacity, to appreciate literature. But the thing that I found interesting was that Guillory in his research made the link between practical criticism and neurophysiology, but did not make the extra link to eugenics. And so when you look up Sherrington and a quick like Google search on Wikipedia, it's very clear that he was a member of the Royal Eugenics Society, which is not unusual at the time because eugenics was a very reputable field and there was a department of it at Harvard. But to me, that's really interesting that he would not have taken that extra step. Is Will gone now, or is he still there? Will,
no, I'm here. I'm listening.
Right. So I think so when we think about people doing literary criticism or doing poetry studies, the fact that he could not take that extra step to see that neurophysiology has a very close link to race science, and thus practical criticism or close reading has a link to eugenics, that's where that blindness and that lack of, it's not even a lack of historical knowledge, because he was willing to go back and find out about Sherrington, but there is a kind of blindness, perhaps, whether it's historical or not, around thinking through the racial implications of that. I don't know if that's
well, when you have this type of energy, you don't have any kind. You're blind to the implication of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. You're completely blind to it, and it doesn't quite settle. You know, it doesn't work, and because it's very closed and it doesn't allow the spectacular nature of English to transpire, and it's very converted into a very small domain.
Right. It is. Yeah, that's right. It's a very small domain of like adding some extra people on a syllabus, or I think even sort of controversy. I mean, I think the controversies, I'm not dismissing them, but I think sort of the controversies around, you know, who's included or not included. I mean, I think they're important, but I think there are other big things. I think we're getting a bunch of questions. Should I just read them, Janice, or?
Yeah, I mean, some of them I think we're kind of addressing.
Right.
I think there's some questions about like specifics on thinking about poetics and poetic form.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of like where we see oppression actually working in language. I mean, one thing that I will say, for me in addressing some of these questions is like, I think partially the challenge for me is like we teach everything in English, right, by necessity. But English, and like many other languages, there's a lot of very certain types of thinking that are inherent in the structure itself, like the fact that it's the subject object, right? That's the order it's always predicated, right? English grammar is always about cause and effect. And these are things that I think we take for granted as realities of the universe, but they're also actually just realities of the language, which create another lens through which we see things. But this kind of linear cause and effect is not a given law of the universe.
Right.
It's not actually how things work.
The centrality of the I, the subject, which in some languages is not.
Yeah. And it doesn't exist. Like in a lot of indigenous languages, that doesn't exist. Like recently I was hearing Pio Kashin Ghost Horse talk about the Western idea we have, the I think therefore I am, and he talked about the difficulty and like the impossibility of translating a phrase like that into his indigenous language, into Lakota, right? None of these concepts exist. Thinking doesn't exist in the same way it exists in English. The I subject doesn't exist the same way. And so a whole concept like that which a lot of like Western modernity is like based on, is not possible in this other language. And I think that's something that's, in terms of like thinking about how we open up our discussions on poetics and poetic form, is like also actually how do we open up our discussions like in the language itself, and how language frames how we actually see everything.
I think it's multi-level. I mean, it's really, as you said, at the level of the sentence, and also at the level of thinking about, like, say, so you could go from the level of the sentence where you're like, I doesn't exist in certain, or it doesn't as central in certain languages, to then going to thinking about the lyric speaker in English poetry, for example, or American poetry, and who has been given that privilege of being that lyric I that gets to be the universal I, right? Like, why is it that Robert Frost, as a middle-aged New England farmer, gets to speak for all of humanity when he's talking about, the road not taken, or his horse stopping in the woods on a snowy evening? So that's a question. And then even bigger, because I see one of the questions we got from Jamie Parra was that, how about even thinking about the whole category of poetry, about whether we need that category, that it seems to me that undisciplining ourselves requires taking poetry itself apart, which is also about not only specific categories of poetry, but because you were just saying to me, Janice, earlier, and I know Will writes across different genres, that you're actually hired as a fiction writer at Portland State. You do poetry. And so do we even need this category or term poetry? And Will has, of course, written plays and draws and does music and everything. So what's the utility of that, even that category of poetry? I guess that was one question.
Can I say something here?
Yeah, did you say something? Yeah, definitely.
Yes, it seems to be that the problem is too skewed in terms of a European setting. What about the whole idea of the poet as an explorer? And I'm not talking about exploring other exotic lands, but exploring the inner consciousness.
Yeah.
About the language of the plasticity of language that it allows movement into that other zone of consciousness. I mean, it does work. If one has 250,000 words, I think it is, in the English language, how can we start to work with them kind of in a way like a painter, rather than a linguistic practitioner in terms that we've been taught? But to take these words and bend them and smear them and coalesce them in ways that open another level of the neurology. We're talking about opening that level of neurology where we can become more adept at grasping a reality, rather than the three-dimensional aspect of a European idea of a fence, or in Williams' idea of a wheelbarrow. Mm-hmm. Or in terms of a delimited, cognitive kind of perception, where you don't get any kind of feeling of adventure, of nuance, of movement, of motion. It's like when you take the European canon and you talk about explorers, say, it's always delimited to, say, somebody like Marco Polo. But what about the movements, like even Batuta, who was able to go into different lands, is never really discussed. And he did this before Marco Polo. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there are other examples of the way one can use consciousness, the consciousness of language, other than a European idea.
No, actually, one of the comments Rizvana Bradley just wrote is relevant to what you're saying, Will. She said the words, she said, we do well to remember the words of Aimé Césaire, poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge.
Correct.
Yeah.
It works in that way.
Yeah, so I think that idea of other forms of knowledge of other psychic explorations that poetic knowledge has access to, that perhaps other forms of language or of analysis don't have access to, which is, I think, why we all believe in poetry a great deal. But and that even relates to what you were saying earlier, Janice, about trauma and healing and the ways in which language can actually be part of that in a way that's not the normal, or just the thematic ways in which people operate or language operates for certain people.
And I like that Césaire quote a lot. I mean, many others have said this before me, but like poetry for me is not necessarily about language, it's about attention, right? And language is the vehicle that we use to represent that attention. But for me, I mean, even as someone who technically writes prose and works with sentences, I think of myself more as a poet, and I get along better with poets because for me, that sensibility is about paying attention, right? And it's about actually being present and sitting with uncertainty a lot and paying attention to these things. And then all of that kind of translates into language as well, right? But it's not just about actually telling stories or retelling stories.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It has to have another meta understanding, I think.
Yeah.
I don't want to break in. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Will. Go ahead.
No, the language has to create what I consider to be a meta field, a field that is beyond the idea of up or down or the way that rectilinear logic works. You know, to break is someone said, I guess it was Pound, to break the linear span, or was the pentameter line, but we want to break way beyond that into another understanding of the way consciousness works. As I said, maybe to look at words kind of like a painter would look at colors. The way that, say, someone like Jean Miro would look at the way that painting is done. Because that's the climate and atmosphere out of which we have been sired, you know, from, as Miro said in 1927, to assassinate painting, to assassinate meaning. You know, we post our toe with post-Breton, but post says that we're post. And sometimes people are wallowing around in stagnant or inconsequential forms in order to get problematical favor, you know, from a contemporary reality that's fast disappearing, rapidly disappearing. How do we explore when we're on the verge? Last night I was listening to a new tape of Greta Thunberg. She was talking about the reality that we're coming into, and not as an individual, but as a sensibility of how we're coming into our next phase, say post-Trump, which is weather. And how do we, in other words, how do we use language to cope and realize ourselves as human beings in this type of state of affairs that we're going through right now?
Right.
How does language use itself to explore?
Because Will, you were talking about being post, but at the same time, I know you and I have talked a lot about how the legacies of, like, I guess the beginnings of racial colonialism, racial capitalism, which it happened at the same time as Enlightenment ideas around reason and forms of knowledge. Those are still long-lasting legacies. And I think everything you've been saying and Janice has been saying about, like, having new forms of consciousness or using.
Of course, and the language allows that to happen. We're at a great turning point now because of the fact that we can use a language that pretty much everybody has access to, and we can have instantaneous contact with the whole planet. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And the main thing to me is to do internal exercise as a being, you know, so we can open up the ducts of language rather than have them superimposed by possible English professor or some kind of tradition, like we're talking about the eugenics model or the I.A. Richards, or those contemporaries that where like Sherrington, you wrote about lived up to 1952, which is not that too terribly far back.
Yeah.
So in other words, that's kind of where the English department sometimes couch themselves and instruct their students to stay in a certain kind of a square. And
Right.
there's some kind of liberation that's taking place. Say for instance, if say Emma Césaire was born an island over, and he was involved in going to London instead of Paris, we might not have had that understanding that we have from Césaire today. I mean, we would have, but not to the same degree, because there was an atmosphere of liberty where, you know, Breton was talking about the liberation of the indigenous spirit. And here was Césaire right there to liberate that area, because how much spirit has been foreclosed on by the academy. That's what we're talking about earlier on.
No, that's that's absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question. And the academy, I mean, that's a whole discussion in itself about how imbricated like poetry writing and creative writing nowadays is so attached to the academy. And obviously for practical reasons, but what is the cost of that as well, right? Actually, one of the questions I'm looking over the chat from Roberto Tejada, he asked about going back to your idea earlier, Janice, of psychic pain and and he asked about thinking about the specificity of poetic form. How do we all view poetry in particular as having a social hold compared to the other arts in the wider redirection of values to which anti-racist work can aspire? I think Will's touched on this, but I'm wondering if, again, Will, you talked about words being used like paint. I'm wondering if there is a specific thing about poetry and language. We did talk about this a little bit, but what's its value for anti-racist work, or I guess new forms of consciousness you've talked about? But
yeah, in other words, the plasticity of language, where you can use a certain kind of a word that I always use this example. For instance, I could say the ship came in to port, or I could say lightning struck Incarnadine frigate, which gives you a whole another balance and another sensation, feel of sensation from which you can go further.
Right.
And I think we've been so stuck into realism and to the four corners or the four squares of, say, the colonial construct that we've been demagnified. I'll coin the word demagnified and put into an obstrepitous, excuse the language here, grading system where we clip our own wings. We're taught to clip our own wings rather than explore. And this whole idea of mistakes should not occur.
Right.
Language should be the release of energy. I'm not talking about a grading scale, but the release of consciousnthis. Yeah. But that's not to excuse mistakes. I wouldn't say mistakes, but a sloppiness. This is profound rigor we're talking about here. Balances and not just dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but hearing the internal states of language. How do we deal with the way that words transmute? You know, saying the way that the words can be seen at the gross level of transmutation in a thesaurus. How these things, go from, and each word, by the way, has a certain weight to it. It has a certain kind of a coloration, a certain kind of smell, and all those things figure in the language. I think that should be, put into some kind of understanding. Yeah, how words weigh themselves.
Well, when I'm teaching poetry to my students, I of course have this bias because I love poetry. I tell them it's the amazing thing about a poem is it's both like, it's got sounds, it's got textures, it's on a page, it has this visual aspect. So it's like, the arrangement is very important, but it's also it's emotional, it's musical, it's philosophical, it's analytical. I feel like poetry, in its use of language, but also its use of just being, I mean, I'm thinking of printed poetry. Obviously there are other kinds of poetry. It actually works on these multiple levels. And as you guys have been saying, can really change consciousness, can really bring you in just to new areas. And are we free from the racial capitalist constructs around, you know, the thinking that we've been bequeathed? No, I don't think we completely, but it offers these possibilities for something different. And I think what you were saying earlier, Will, about the indigeneity and the indigenous knowledge that somehow just got completely quashed or very marginalized, and other forms of, like Janice, you were saying, other languages that don't privilege a linearity, or like, I just feel like even though there is so much power, like and different aspects of capitalism that weigh on us, but there's something about reading a poem or being in the middle of poetry that you feel that there's this possibility, because it works on so many different levels, like the bodily, it's pleasurable, makes you think, it does. I mean, but I'm very biased because I love poetry, you know, but I don't know how you think about that, Janice. Maybe you want to say something.
No, I think exactly. I mean, I think the thing that poetry lets us do is that it reminds us that we don't actually just think with our brains, right? Like it resists the just strictly rational, logical thinking. It actually reminds us that we also are thinking and feeling with our hearts, with our guts and our bellies. It's bodily, and that actually is really important because there's a lot more truth, I think, in what our other kind of like centers of thought or feeling have to say rather than our logical minds, right? Which is actually like creating narratives. Often it's both the smartest part of us, right? Like our thinking minds, like we're the smartest when we use our minds, and we're also the dumbest because we can easily create new narratives and outsmart ourselves.
Right.
So I think poetry lets us bypass that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Will, did you want to say?
It expands the being. Yeah, it expands the being. I mean, when you can not worry about yourself. I mean, this is one of the things about art. It does liberate you and let you fly a bit, you know, go above the what I use the term above the human nerve domain. It's one of the titles of my book. But getting above or beyond, you know, like the psychology of the rishis. In Hindu poetry or in Indian poetry, going beyond the object, going beyond the four corners of the desk, and not to use Dr. Williams in the American grain. We're no longer in the American grain at this time. We're in another zone now. We can see this past 2 weeks, 2 months, it's taken us into other dimensions of possibility, and people feel that kind of liberty taking place that wasn't there before, and you're not worried about a grade or a condition or a condition of stricture that allows you to self-monitor yourself. It's one of the great things about surrealism. It opens the fact that you don't monitor language. Language has something to say over and beyond your own personal ideas about the language. In other words, in that sense, it's non-utilitarian.
Right. And
I think that's one of the things that people get in the academy is check marks on something that it's non-utilitarian. Even though it's beautiful, they want to dismantle it so that it lowers its energy to make sense and fit into a collapsible fragment. Or a hardened fragment. I wouldn't say collapsible, but a hardened fragment.
I mean, I think also the study of poetry in the academy is very much about studying the poem as a museum object. It's like a painting in a museum. It's like, you know, you look at it stripped away from its historical, ideological context and everything. And it's just a very, I just think it's a misguided way to think about poetry. And what you guys have been saying, and also what Will was saying, did he just cut off or?
I think Will just disappeared.
He disappeared. Okay. So Will was saying about being outside the American grain, like this moment, and what you were saying too, Janice, about thinking about American or English language poetry outside of just English language poetry outside of just England or the UK and the American context, but actually having that language be energized by non-English languages or just or even English used in, say, like Asia, like, or in Africa, right? It doesn't have to be just in this kind of Anglo-American context.
I wanna be conscious of time. So we're at 7. So maybe I know we can't answer all of the questions. But
Right. There are a couple here. Maybe I see one from Elena Siegel. Do you want to read that one, or can you see the questions? I could read that one on the Q&A. I think they're coming up on the Q&A and the chat. So maybe I'll read this one because it's kind of related to what we're saying. It said, Elena Siegel says, in response to Janice's earlier question regarding how we can escape the structures of the language which continue to recapitulate themselves, specifically English and its mercantile subject-object structure, and Will's recent comment about destroying the linearity in poetry, I often feel like poetry is a space of exploration in which we can invent anew a different trajectory in consciousness. But when I return to human interaction and dialogue, I feel like I am recapitulating these confining and pernicious forms. How do we radicalize speech and language outside of the contained space of poetry and poetic studies? And that was the question that Elena has. Do you want to answer that, Janice?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my answer is going to be like really abstract, you know, but
Yeah.
I think similar to kind of what Will was saying is that it's like we have to expand consciousness in order to expand a relationship to language. And so I think it's just that kind of like continuing to really look closely and to strip away those layers and to be really conscious and aware and ask questions. I mean, for me, it always comes down to like, I don't know, right? Like I look at something and like sitting with that, I don't know, and I don't understand everything. Like if I face something and I feel like I'm at a state of complete understanding, like there's actually something wrong with my assumption of what it is that I'm looking at, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I think, I'm just mindful of the time. I wanted to see if we could also bring in some of the other questions. Janice, I don't know if you want to.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Will, are you there?
I'll say one thing.
Did you hear that last question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Paraphrase.
Oh, the last question? Well, the last question that how do we bring that radicalization, how do we radicalize speech and language outside of the contained space of poetry and poetic studies? Like, how do we bring that into our I guess, our real lives, or quote unquote?
You have to go find it. I think you have to find it in the adventure of living. And there's no guardrails for that. You have to be able to open yourself to a certain kind of a rhythm where you find your own glossary, so to speak, through your own autokinetics. In other words, you transmute to your own neurology.
So not just in your poetry, Will, but also in your living. You're living as you go.
Yeah, not just the writing. It's not an app. In other words, I'm saying language is not an abstraction, but it's something that you actually feel, and that's why it communicates to others, because you're not there to instruct somebody as to how they should feel about your work, but it just gives you the feeling automatically because you're living that way. You're feeling that way. You're not trying to think that way. That's another thing. You're not thinking, you're feeling language. And that's why other people are able to communicate with it and feel it themselves. Not to copy it, but to experience it.
Right.
In fact, you continue to keep yourself moving to such a degree that you don't stand around just to memorize yourself as a fragment or memorize a text that just is memory over and over again, but to continue to create new text, new energies, new possibilities all the time. You surprise yourself. So that's what we're interested in is opening that up, because we're in this type of a world now that's the title was to Protracted Tribulation is what we're entering into now. What kind of poems are going to come up when the cosmos switches? And I'm not saying that in an abstract or metaphysical sense, but when they measured a sheet of lightning that was going across 3 states from Texas to Oklahoma to Kansas. That's what the kind of energy we're talking about that we've inherited as human beings. So actually, we're not creating something. We're inheriting an energy field that we are not open to because of, quote, civilization, quote, certain types of civilization that squander the possibilities of relationship to living. Maybe we're getting to that point now with the past several weeks, something that's broken open. But I don't mean that in a limited way, but in a protracted way. We don't know how it's going to turn out. We don't have any rational idea about the way that life is going at this time. And we don't want that, but you should experience it as it opens. not trying to control it.
Right. I mean, I think it is a question, just go back to the question from Elena about like, yeah, because one thing I love talking with you about, Will, is this like expansiveness of time and consciousness across history, vertically, horizontally. But then I do think sometimes like I know I work as a teacher in a university set or college setting, and some of the kind of concrete practical pressures that we face, and all of us face as people of color, we all face them in our daily lives. It is a kind of like figuring out how to navigate both that expansiveness of consciousness through language or poetry or wanting to think differently, but also, as I think Janice was talking earlier about the kinds of real traumas or PTSDs that people are dealing with, right? So this, I don't have, I don't think any of us does, but yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Janice and I, and all three of us have been long-time colleagues in terms of just spontaneous conversations. Janice and I, we talk all the time, right? And have been for years. And to get into the plasticity of the moment, sometimes you say, well, I'll wait till I get to my writing desk, but just make sure you have something that you can sketch something down, because it's magic. Mm-hmm. When you start to hear something, even if a young poet is starting off and he or she just hears an inner sound coming up, it could just be an article or a one word. Write it down, because it's a key to unlocking those subconscious gusts that come through, as you develop, because you have to develop a certain kind of a way of being in the world. Mm-hmm. There's no script for this. That's one thing about the liberty of writing, is no script for in particular poetry. There's no script for it. Mm-hmm. But we're always looking for scripts and manuals and I call them, they're just general disguises. They don't really mean anything, mm-hmm. But they don't give you energy. They don't grow. They don't envelop the internal reality. Well, when you can say, for instance, you put on a shirt that doesn't match. It's like when you take somebody else's ideas, you put a shirt, it's like putting a shirt on that doesn't match. Yeah, when somebody says, oh, that's the voice, that's you. When you hear Miles Davis play a horn, you know that's him. Eric Dolphy, you know that's him. Mm-hmm. All the great artists, you have to get to the point where you get to an essence, up or down, lower or high, or whatever that voice is. Go with that feeling, go with that energy. That's what you got to do. And that's what poetry is over time. It's not a correct way, but it's an energetic way. Mm-hmm. That's why we read. That's why we get ideas. This is why we have emotions and feel from what we experience through others, others' investigations. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that'll come off to us personally, and we can transmute it so it can be our way of speaking. Not the way someone else speaks, but the way we need to speak. However that is. So I never get into any dogmatism with the person, but try to bring that energy out of a student, not to dogmatize, but to bring the energy that they have, not that I have. Right. And that way it can begin to mingle, and then it can be expanded and come out with something startling and new and fresh that can help us out through this period. Because poetry is very important right now because of the fact that we are isolated as individuals in little rooms and with our families and with uncomfortable conditions sometimes. But poetry is a place for us where we can go inside of ourselves. Everything in the society that we are dealing with is always trying to pull us out.
Right.
So one of the, and I don't want to talk too much, but I'm just getting on a kind of a roll there, but that's fine.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think and in some ways you're very lucky that like poetry isn't your career. I mean, in the sense that you're not, I mean, it is your career, but but you're not hired as part of an institution, I think.
Oh, no, not at all. That's why I stayed away.
Right. Because I think it's actually quite, I think it's wonderful. I mean, in a way to harness that energy and to feel that. And it's actually I find it, I'm not a poet. I mean, I'm a critic. I mean, I'm a scholar. I find it difficult when you're in the apparatus of institutions that, you know, that you try your best with your students. And I feel the same way you do, Will, that you pull whatever's about a particular student out of them, whatever that energy is particular to them. It's not what we're imposing on them, it's what they have inside of them. But sometimes that,
No,
you
it's
know,
not an object.
yeah. Go
It's
ahead.
not an objective kind of slate. You're checking off marks or anything like that. But each individual has a certain kind of a peculiar essence or genius, if you want to say it like that. A certain kind of a feel for certain kinds of language at a certain point that they should be encouraged to go into their inclination. It's the way that heels wear on shoes. Some people wear heels, and because of the way their balance is structured, and the shoes wear in a certain direction that just personal to that individual.
Right.
It's a balances. We're talking about balances here.
But it is difficult
Balance.
when you're in certain kinds of fields, or, you know, there's these parameters of what people expect or don't expect, right? So one has to always sort of push against that as well, with like trying
That is interesting. How to become radical. How to not. And I'm not saying politically, but in a certain way you should politically, but also to do it as an individual. How do you radicalize yourself? And I mean, go into your own direction rather than through a standard model.
That's right. That's the hard part. That's the part where
that's
what yeah.
That's what I think the jazz musicians say, work. I remember a Nat Adderley tune where one of the audience members says, work. You have to work when nobody's watching. And then Janice and I used to talk. We were always in these great discussions where we were always working. That's what I admire about both of you, is that you're always working and always searching consciousness. It's amazing. It's very inspiring.
Well, we feel the same way about you, Will, of course.
Yeah.
And both you and Janice for me. So yeah, no, I think it's wonderful that actually, and I think even the conversation is breaking down those boundaries also between like creative work or poets and then people doing like scholarly or poetry studies. Usually those are so cordoned off too. So it's wonderful that we can actually have these conversations where it's like, you know, you guys are practicing poets, you also write fiction, you do these other things, you know, and then we could talk about these things. I just think all these like these silos that we have everywhere, they're so soul killing, but they're so much a part of like what we have in institutions usually, you know.
To poeticize facts, to poeticize history, to poeticize geology, to poeticize astronomy. This is where you get into some interesting things, because these disciplines have incredible vocabularies that poets need to work with. Not the sunset or the wheelbarrows or the flower patches. We don't need any repetition, because we're in a state where we're opening up into, as the world has just shown us in the past few months, we're opening up into a new state of wonder.
Right.
You know, we're in a state where, you know, the great Avi Loeb, the astronomer heads the astronomy department at Harvard, talks about going into, you know, taking out nanocells to go into other galaxies. And in poetry seminars, they're talking about reading something 150 years ago. Not that 150 years ago is not valuable, but it doesn't lead us anywhere.
Right.
In other words, it doesn't affect the neurology of the being that's trying to express a fresh and incandescent language.
I mean, Dorothy, you were talking about all of the silos. I mean, I think it's like something that we create to comfort ourselves, but like really everything is constantly permeable. And like that's what poetics is partially about to me, is like that constant permeability that's allowed, that isn't allowed in other aspects of our life, right? I mean, I think about like Anna Singh's book where, you know, she talks about like even the term species is like a misnomer. There's no species in the entire world that can exist individually. right? So the fact that we try to contain things in these categories, none of those categories are actually individual. It doesn't exist in nature.
Right. And that is the legacy of what we were talking earlier about, these different kinds of like classificatory systems of language, and out of which, you know, we get things like eugenics or race science. But poetry studies and aesthetics has also been done violence to in that way, I think. So yeah, and so I think that is the hope, that out of this pandemic and out of this crisis and out of like the horrors of, you know, just like the sort of the visible horrors, the horrors have always been there, but the visible horrors on videotape of like the utter violence that's just part of like the American way of life, which includes, you know, all our thinking about our aesthetics as well, that this offers some change, possibility for change, for something new. I mean, I'm realistic too, that's going to take a lot of work. I'm not, but as Will, you were saying too, that, you know, maybe there's a possibility here for something.
There is possibilities because there's energy that's been awakened. The thing is to awaken. When you wake energy up, you just can't let it fly out and just write anything. Like a poet has energy, but you got to know how to direct the energy. Case in point, when I first started writing poems, I was writing 2 or 3 of them a day at least. And the energy was flowing out, but I had to discipline that energy, you know, to get it to a point where it was like medicinal. Mm-hmm. And that's what poetry is, medicinal language. It's not it's very accurate and mathematical, really, because it's surgical. And it gets the job done. You know, it's got a great surgeon is like a great poet. When he has a difficult problem, for instance. I myself had energies, you know, cast upon me at a certain point when I was under an operating table for many hours, and I had to trust the situation. My life was gone.
Right.
I was like 10 hours under a surgical knife some years ago. So this is, but he had the doctor had the poetic text, knowing where to stitch, where to sew. That's what language does. You have to know exactly where the sound is. You have to have an ear. You cannot read upon an ear or train an ear, but you have to understand that the ear has to have its own understanding. That's the hard part, I think, you know, because you can read a million books and not come up with anything. And I don't mean that in a just simple pejorative manner, but you got to really hear what you're saying and feeling, and what you're feeling, not only what you're saying, but what you're feeling, and how all those energies merge in a word. You get into the sonics, where the sonics also cast sound, but intelligence, and an array of sensibilities that come to bear upon the page.
Right. I'm just mindful of the time, Janice. I'm wondering, because we had a lot of questions. Yeah.
I think maybe.
Oh, I hope we should get the questions in if we can.
I think we did already. Well, I mean, I think we brought in some, not everybody. Unfortunately, I feel bad that we didn't. But
yeah, but I also want to be mindful. I mean, I know it's a lot later on the East Coast, so
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay. So, but yeah, no. I mean, maybe do you guys have any final thoughts before we wrap up? Will?
Well, just happy that we could join together and have this discussion, and glad that this transpired. At least, and as far as I'm concerned, my partial contribution here, but I'm happy to have been, here with in this circumstance with the both of you.
Yeah, we're really happy you joined in, even though all the technical problems are just a function, as Janice said, of the uncertainty of the times, and all part and parcel of what we're all going through. But yeah, I'm really happy. I think the questions were great. I'm sort of looking at the chat, even though we didn't get to all the questions, there were a lot of interesting comments people were making. And I'm really glad that the three of us were able to join together and talk about these things. And I think it is about, I think it gives me hope. I mean, I know a lot of times this is a difficult time, but I think that what we discussed, and especially really thinking, I mean, for me, really, poetry is a special thing, and you guys are part of that, and you guys are creating these new forms of consciousness and writing that are so important for the future of like literary studies and American literature, English literature, world literature. I mean, I just think that we have to think differently for how we've been going and how we think about forms of knowledge. And everything, and how we think about just everything, race, poetry,
How we live under
how
these
we live
conditions.
as people,
How
right?
do we live?
Right, everything, consciousness. So thank you so much, and I guess we just thank the audience, thank everyone for being out there. We can't hear you guys, but
I
thank you.
want to thank everybody for your patience and your understanding and being there for us. Being there for yourselves and being there for the community of art.
Yeah, thank everyone for for supporting art and Beyond Baroque and poetry and everything. So thank you so much. We can't hear you. We wish you could hear you, but I guess we'll sign off right now.
Yeah, we'll sign off, but we'll get to a certain point where we can all be here live with one another, where we can really go further.
That's right. Someday we'll be able to join together, maybe in LA or Portland or somewhere. So that'll be great. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for everyone for coming out, and thanks to Janice and everybody at Beyond Baroque and Will, and hope everyone has a good evening. Yeah. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.